My son said I was too old, too slow, and too much trouble to care for. So he put me in a nursing home without my permission and moved into my house like I'd already passed on. But I wasn't confused. I wasn't finished with life. And while he thought I'd fade away quietly in that facility, I was planning something else entirely. Something he'd feel every time he opened his front door. This is how I made my son regret the day he ever underestimated his mother. The night before it all happened, I'd made Matthew's favorite meal, pot roast with rosemary potatoes and the apple pie his father taught me to bake 50 years ago. I'd set the table with the good china, the wedding set Robert's mother had given us that I only used for special occasions. The crystal glasses caught the evening light, throwing rainbows across the dining room walls. I wanted everything to be perfect because Matthew had called, saying he needed to discuss something important. I thought perhaps he was going to talk about Jessica going to medical school, or maybe even that Caroline was expecting another child, though they'd always said one was enough. The house smelled of home and history. Decades of Sunday dinners, Christmas mornings, birthday celebrations. Every corner held memories. The living room where I'd taught Matthew to read. The hallway where we'd marked his height each year on his birthday. The kitchen where I'd comforted him through his first heartbreak. This wasn't just a house. It was the physical embodiment of our family story. I remember looking at my reflection in the hallway mirror before they arrived, tucking a strand of silver hair behind my ear. My hands were spotted with age, the knuckles slightly swollen from arthritis, but they were strong hands. Capable hands. These hands had held my infant son, had typed reports during my 30 years as a school administrator, had planted gardens and painted walls and carried grief when Robert died. These were not the hands of someone who needed to be taken care of. I raised Matthew with hands that never stopped working and a heart that never stopped giving. He was all I had after Robert, my husband, passed away from cancer 20 years ago. Robert's death wasn't quick or merciful. 18 months of surgeries, treatments, hope followed by despair. Matthew was just finishing college then. I remember how he'd sit at his father's bedside reading financial magazines while Robert drifted in and out of consciousness. Even then, in the midst of our family's greatest pain, Matthew had seemed slightly detached, as if observing our tragedy from a safe distance. After the funeral, when it was just the two of us, I sold our larger family home. The one with the wraparound porch that Robert had always loved, and bought the smaller, 3-bedroom Craftsman, where I could manage on my own. I used the proceeds to pay off Robert's medical bills and help Matthew with the down payment on his first condo. He hadn't asked for the money, but I'd insisted. "Your father would have wanted you to start your life without debt," I'd told him, pushing the check across the table. He'd thanked me with a quick hug, already talking about investment potential and property values. I worked 2 jobs, receptionist at the local high school by day, cleaning offices by night. My knees would ache as I vacuumed endless corporate carpets, but I never complained. I darned the same cardigans for years rather than buying new ones. I cut my own hair to save on salon costs. I sold my good jewelry piece by piece, the pearl necklace Robert gave me on our 5th anniversary, the gold bracelet from my mother, even my engagement ring after a particularly expensive semester of Matthew's textbooks. The diamond wasn't large, but the money helped him finish his accounting degree without student loans. And I never once complained or asked for gratitude. I just believed that the love I gave would come back to me when I needed it most. Isn't that what we all secretly hope? That the sacrifices we make for our children build not just their futures but our safety nets? That they'll remember the nights we went hungry so they could eat, the dreams we deferred so theirs could flourish? When I fell in the garden that Thursday afternoon, I didn't think it was serious. Probably just dehydration. I'd been planting new roses in the summer heat, without taking enough water breaks. The peace roses, creamy yellow with pink edges, had been Robert's favorites. I'd planted them every spring since his passing, a living memorial more meaningful than the granite headstone over his grave. I remember the rich smell of the soil as I knelt beside the flower bed, the feel of the warm earth between my fingers as I carefully positioned each plant. Gardening had always been my meditation, my way of processing grief and finding hope. Each bloom was a small victory against loss, a reminder that beauty persists even after heartbreak. The dizziness struck suddenly, the world tilting sideways, the ground rushing up to meet me. I must have blacked out briefly. When I came to, I was lying awkwardly beside the rose bushes, dirt on my face, a dull ache in my hip. It took me nearly 15 minutes to drag myself to the porch and another 10 to pull myself up the steps. By the time I reached the phone in the kitchen, my hands were trembling, but more from frustration than fear. Mrs. Abernathy next door had seen me fall. Before I could even call my doctor, she'd already phoned Matthew, her voice carrying through the open window. "Your mother had quite a spill. No, she's moving around, but at her age. Yes, I think someone should check on her." At her age. 3 simple words that somehow stripped me of my personhood, reducing me to a category, a problem, a burden. Matthew rushed over that evening with Caroline, both of them looking more concerned than the situation warranted. Caroline's blonde hair was pulled back in a tight ponytail, her lips pressed into what she probably thought was a sympathetic smile, but looked more like discomfort. She'd always been somewhat uncomfortable around me, treating our conversations like job interviews she hadn't prepared for. "Lan, we're worried about you," Matthew said, while Caroline nodded along like they'd rehearsed this conversation. He paced the living room, hands in his pockets, examining the family photos on the mantel as if seeing them for the first time. "Living alone at your age, falls can be serious. Hip fractures, head injuries." "I didn't fracture anything," I said, trying to keep the irritation from my voice. "I just got a little lightheaded." Caroline touched my arm. "Eleanor, we just want what's best for you. We want to help you figure out your next steps." That was the expression he used, next steps, as if I was already on my way out. They brought casseroles that I didn't ask for, stacking them in my refrigerator, pushing aside the healthy meals I'd prepared for myself that week. Caroline opened my cupboards without asking, rearranging my spices into alphabetical order, though I'd organized them by frequency of use for 40 years. Matthew wandered through the house, making notes on a small pad, muttering about potential hazards and accessibility issues. They kept mentioning how challenging it must be to maintain a house at my age. I was 72, not 102. I still walked 3 miles every morning. I still drove myself to volunteer at the library twice a week. I still completed the New York Times crossword puzzle in pen every Sunday. "Have you thought about downsizing?" Caroline asked, running her hand along my kitchen counter. "This house has so many stairs, so much maintenance." "I manage just fine," I replied, perhaps too sharply. "This is my home." "Of course it is, Mom. Of course it is, Mom," Matthew said soothingly. "But wouldn't you like more company, more people your own age around?" I looked at him, really looked at him, this stranger wearing my son's face. When had he started seeing me as old? When had he stopped seeing me as his mother, the woman who had taught him to tie his shoes and ride a bicycle and navigate heartache? When had I transformed in his eyes from a person to a problem? As they were leaving, Matthew lingered in the doorway. "I'll come by tomorrow to fix that loose banister," he said. "And maybe we could look at some brochures I picked up, just to explore options." The word options hung in the air between us, loaded with unspoken intentions. What I didn't know then, what I couldn't have imagined, was that they had already set their plan in motion. The options weren't options at all. They were a formality, a pretense of giving me a choice when the decision had already been made. I didn't realize they'd already consulted with an elder care attorney. I didn't know they were telling the neighbors I was having memory problems. I had no idea Caroline was already measuring my living room for the furniture she planned to bring in. In the days that followed, I noticed small changes around the house. Matthew had installed grip bars in my shower without asking. Caroline had replaced my ceramic dishes with lightweight plastic ones, as if I could no longer be trusted with breakable items. My house keys disappeared from their usual hook, reappearing on a childish lanyard that Matthew insisted I wear around my neck. "So you don't misplace them, Mom." Each change was small, almost imperceptible. But together they formed a pattern. A subtle reshaping of my environment to reinforce a narrative of decline. They were collecting evidence, building a case against my independence, one safety measure at a time. Mrs. Abernathy stopped me on my morning walk, her face pinched with concern. "Matthew told me about your memory issues, dear," she said, patting my arm. "So brave of you to keep up your routine. If you ever get confused, you just come right to my door." I was so stunned I couldn't even respond. Memory issues? I'd forgotten my reading glasses at the library once last month. I'd missed a dental appointment because I'd written down the wrong date. Normal occurrences that happen to people of any age, now being reframed as symptoms of cognitive decline. Later that week, I overheard Caroline on the phone in my kitchen, speaking in the hushed, serious tone people reserve for discussions of terminal illness. "The denial is the hardest part," she was saying. "The doctor said that's common in the early stages. Yes, we're looking at facilities now. Just until we sell her house and add the in-law suite to ours. I know it's heartbreaking." I stood in the hallway, blood rushing in my ears, as my daughter-in-law calmly discussed dismantling my life, as if I were already gone. As if my home, the home I'd maintained alone for 2 decades, was already theirs to sell. That night, I searched my office for important documents, discovering that several folders were missing. My will, my advance directive, the deed to my house. A cold feeling settled in my stomach as I realized how methodically they had been working, how carefully they had been laying the groundwork. 2 weeks later, they invited me to Sunday brunch. "Just us 3, Matthew said. "You deserve some pampering." He smiled the way he used to when he was a boy asking for an extra cookie. I didn't bring a change of clothes. I didn't take my medications. I didn't even wear comfortable shoes. They drove me to what they called a retirement community, with bland artwork in the hallways and the distinct smell of industrial cleaner. "Just for a short evaluation," Matthew assured me. "The staff will help you settle in." He hugged me tightly, like a son who truly cared. Caroline kissed my cheek, her perfume overpowering. Then they walked back to the car and drove away. I never saw that car turn around. The room had generic furniture, no personal items, not even a decent reading lamp. I asked the aide from my phone to call Matthew. She looked uncomfortable and said, "You'll need to speak with administration about phone privileges." I insisted. "My son just left. I need to talk to him." She hesitated, then showed me a clipboard with forms. My name at the top, Matthew's signature at the bottom. Boxes checked for residential admission, medical evaluation, observation status, secure facility protocol. He had committed me. Like a criminal. Like someone who couldn't think for herself. I sat on the edge of that unfamiliar bed with my hands pressed to my mouth, trying to process what had happened. How could the child I raised, the boy I sacrificed everything for, do this to me? The next morning I requested to speak with the facility director. I explained clearly that there had been a misunderstanding. I wasn't cognitively impaired. I was perfectly capable of living independently. She looked at me with practiced sympathy. "Your son indicated you've been experiencing confusion and several falls. We understand this transition is difficult, but we're prepared for long-term care." I wanted to shout, but I didn't. Something told me that any display of emotion would only be documented as further evidence of my supposed instability. So I waited 5 days in that sterile room. On the 6th day, I finally gained access to a phone. I called Matthew repeatedly, straight to voicemail each time. I tried Caroline, 1 ring, then nothing. Blocked. The woman who used to cry on my shoulder about her difficult childhood had blocked my number. I sat by the window looking at other residents in the courtyard. Some were clearly in cognitive decline. Some shouted at shadows, some stared vacantly. And I wondered, is this what I've earned after a lifetime of giving? Is this where my story ends? No. Absolutely not. That night I asked the evening nurse for paper and pen. I told her I found journaling therapeutic. She kindly brought me a small notebook from the activities room. I didn't write poetry or reflections. I wrote facts, account numbers, property details, names of old contacts, my rights as a homeowner, the name of my attorney from 5 years ago, Franklin Burgess, who had helped me update my will when Robert passed. I wrote everything methodically, like a general planning a counterattack, because that's exactly what it was. I wasn't confused. I wasn't helpless. And I certainly wasn't ready to disappear. They assumed I wouldn't notice when they changed my mailing address. They thought I wouldn't recognize that my utility bills were now in Matthew's name. They believed being over 70 meant I couldn't fight back. But they forgot what I'd survived. Widowhood at 52. Raising a child alone. Working until my hands ached. Beating breast cancer at 65. No, this would not be my end. This would be my resurrection. And when I came back, I wouldn't simply ask for my keys. I would reclaim everything they took, and then some. Franklin Burgess didn't answer my first 2 calls. When I finally reached him on the 3rd try, I left a clear, precise message. Franklin, this is Eleanor Winters. My son has placed me in a care facility against my will and may be committing financial exploitation. I need legal representation immediately. I still have access to funds. Please call me back. He returned my call the next morning. Mrs. Winters? Are you safe? As safe as a woman can be when her only child locks her away and thinks she can get away with it, I replied. There was a pause. Tell me everything, he said. So I did. He arrived at the facility 3 days later, briefcase in hand, looking exactly as I remembered. Tall, silver-haired, with the confident stride of someone who knew exactly how powerful the law could be when wielded correctly. The staff became visibly nervous when he announced himself as my attorney. The administrator tried to explain they were simply following standard protocol for an elderly resident in need of supervision. Franklin wasn't having it. He came to my room, sat down and said simply, "You're not staying here another week. And if they give us trouble, we'll add them to the lawsuit." It felt like breathing fresh air after being underwater. We reviewed everything. The admission forms Matthew had signed, the power of attorney he had fabricated, the deed to my house that still bore only my name, the joint bank account he thought I'd forgotten about. "How aggressive do you want to be?" Franklin asked. I looked him directly in the eyes and said, "I don't want revenge. I want justice." He nodded. "Let's start by revoking everything. You're mentally competent. You have rights. First, we strip him of any legal control he thinks he has." Within days, Franklin filed emergency motions to invalidate the fraudulent power of attorney. We submitted a cognitive capacity evaluation from the facility's own doctor, who had privately told me he saw no indication of dementia or significant cognitive decline. We opened a case against Matthew for elder exploitation and misrepresentation of legal documents. And we froze the joint account he'd been using to pay his new car loan. I walked out of the nursing home on a Tuesday morning. No ceremonial goodbyes, no paperwork to sign, just a small bag of belongings and my dignity intact. The fresh air outside the facility's doors never smelled sweeter. We didn't go directly to my house. I couldn't face it yet. Franklin arranged for me to stay at a comfortable extended stay hotel while we prepared our next moves. Matthew didn't know I was free yet, but he would soon enough. During that week, Franklin filed a petition for a forced sale of my property. Since Matthew was living in a home he didn't legally own, and I had never given permission for him to take residence, we had every right to compel a sale. If he refused to vacate, the courts would intervene, and law enforcement would remove him. And since I remained the sole legal owner, every penny from the sale would come to me. I imagined Matthew and Caroline sitting in my sunroom, drinking coffee from my china cups, telling themselves they'd done the right thing by putting poor, confused mother in a safe place. They hadn't inherited anything. They had stolen it, and now they would face the consequences. The legal process moved swiftly. We served them the paperwork at 8 a.m. on a Thursday. According to Franklin's process server, Caroline slammed the door in his face after turning pale. Matthew wasn't home, probably at work at the accounting firm where he'd built his career on being meticulously ethical with other people's money. That evening, my hotel phone rang repeatedly, a number I didn't recognize. Finally, I answered. "Mom." Matthew's voice sounded strained, almost childlike. "We received some legal documents today. What's happening?" I remained silent, letting him fill the space. "You can't be serious," he continued. "You're going to force me out of the family home?" I took a slow breath. "You mean the home you forced me out of?" The line went quiet. "I never signed those admission forms," I said calmly. "You forged my signature, took over my accounts, and tried to erase me from my own life." "That's not what happened," he protested. "We were trying to keep you safe. You were having memory issues. You fell in the garden." I was left in a facility with no personal belongings, no explanation, and no choice, I interrupted. "I was lied to, manipulated, and legally violated. So yes, Matthew, I'm completely serious." His voice cracked. "You're really going through with this?" "Yes," I replied, "and you have 30 days to vacate my property." I ended the call before he could respond. That night, I slept peacefully for the first time in weeks. Franklin and I celebrated with takeout Chinese food in my hotel room. It wasn't glamorous, but it was my choice, on my terms. The next day we met with a potential buyer, a retired professor looking for a home close to his grandchildren. He loved the mature oak trees in the yard, the built-in bookshelves, the character of the place. "This house has good bones," he said, running his hand along the kitchen counter I had polished for 20 years. I nodded. "It deserves someone who will appreciate it." I accepted his offer by the end of the week. We set closing for 20 days later, well within Matthew's eviction timeline. Matthew didn't contact me again, but Caroline did. She sent a text message. "How could you do this to your own son? We were only trying to help you. This house was supposed to be our future." I stared at her words for a long moment, then responded with one line. "I was your past, and you buried me too soon." Then I blocked her number. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't even feel angry anymore. I felt clear, focused, and ready for whatever came next. The final walkthrough of my house was bittersweet. The rooms were mostly empty. Just the marks on the walls where my pictures had hung and the lingering scent of the rosemary I'd grown in the kitchen window. They were gone. Moved out a week before the deadline. Matthew hadn't contested the sale. He hadn't shown up for the inspection. Caroline had left behind some unwanted items and a note taped to the refrigerator that said simply, "I hope you're satisfied." But satisfaction wasn't what I felt. I felt vindicated. The sale proceeded smoothly. The professor was delighted. I shook his hand at closing and wished him many happy years in the home. Just like that, the house I had cleaned, maintained, and loved for decades belonged to someone else. Someone who would respect its history. With the proceeds safely deposited in my new account, at a different bank, with no joint access, my attorney asked the important question. "What's next for you, Eleanor?" I smiled. "I've been thinking about that." We didn't rush. Revenge is a dish best served cold, as they say. But this wasn't about revenge anymore. This was about reclaiming my life on my terms. We waited for Matthew and Caroline to settle into their new place, a condo across town, according to my neighbors who still kept in touch. We waited for the gossip to die down, and then I did something they never anticipated. I bought a house on their street. Not next door, I wasn't that petty, but close enough. A charming single story with a garden perfect for my roses and a porch ideal for morning coffee. 3 houses down, with a clear view of their driveway. I paid cash, no mortgage. Franklin handled the paperwork discreetly. I signed the documents with steady hands, feeling not triumph, but a sense of completion. I hadn't told anyone about my plan, not even my granddaughter Jessica. This moment belonged to me first. The day I moved in, I wore my favorite blue dress and sat on the front porch, arranging potted geraniums. Just an ordinary grandmother settling into a new home. And then Matthew drove past, slowing instinctively when he recognized me. The look on his face, shock, disbelief, perhaps even fear, wasn't as satisfying as I'd imagined. Instead, it made me sad for what we'd lost. But I didn't look away. I simply nodded once and continued with my flowers. He accelerated quickly and didn't look back. In the days that followed, they established a pattern. Caroline would drive out early, avoiding my usual gardening time. Matthew would leave for work with his gaze fixed straight ahead. They pulled their blinds tighter. They parked in their garage instead of the driveway. I didn't pursue them. I didn't wave or call out. I simply lived my life, visibly, vibrantly, independently. I planted a vegetable garden. I joined the neighborhood association. I hosted a book club. I existed loudly in the space they had tried to remove me from. Franklin called it elegant payback. I called it living well. 2 weeks after I moved in, Jessica came to visit. At 23, she was caught between loyalty to her parents and love for her grandmother. She hesitated at my gate, then walked up the path and knocked tentatively. I welcomed her with open arms. "Come in, sweetheart. I've made lemonade." We sat on the porch together. I poured her a glass of lemonade the way I used to when she was little and afraid of thunderstorms. She seemed nervous at first, fidgeting with her glass. Finally, she spoke. "They told me you were having dementia episodes, that you couldn't take care of yourself anymore." I remained calm. "Do I seem confused to you?" She shook her head. "No, you seem exactly like yourself." "I always was," I said gently. She leaned forward. "Why did you buy a house on their street?" "Dad's freaking out." "Because your father needed to remember," I replied. "Every day when he drives past, he needs to see that I'm still here. Still capable. Still me." Jessica gave a small laugh. "That's pretty hardcore, Grandma," I smiled. "I prefer to think of it as instructive." She stayed for dinner that evening. Told me about her nursing classes, about the boy she was dating, about her plans for the future. It felt normal, healing. She hugged me tightly before leaving. "Can I come back tomorrow?" she asked. "Anytime," I answered. "My door is always open to you." She became a regular visitor after that. Sometimes she stayed overnight in my guest room. Sometimes she brought her laundry or studied at my kitchen table. I never asked about her parents. I didn't need to. The strained silence between her visits told me everything. A month after I moved in, Matthew appeared on my porch. He stood awkwardly, perhaps hands in his pockets, looking older somehow. "Mom," he said simply. I didn't invite him in. "Matthew, why are you doing this?" he asked. "Living here, watching us." I tilted my head. "I bought this house because I liked the neighborhood." "You're trying to punish me," he said, his voice tight. I shook my head. "No, Matthew, you punished yourself when you decided I was disposable." He looked away. "I was trying to help you." "No," I corrected gently. "You were helping yourself to my life, to my home, to my dignity." He had no response. I stood from my chair. "I raised you alone, gave you everything I had, and when I needed compassion, you saw only inconvenience." His eyes glistened. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I accept your apology," I said. "But that doesn't erase what happened." "What do you want from me?" he asked. "Nothing," I replied honestly. "I've already taken back everything I need." Then I went inside and closed the door gently. I didn't cry. I didn't shake. I simply returned to my puzzle book and felt the weight of the past finally beginning to lift. Some people believe closure comes when someone apologizes. I disagree. I believe closure comes when their opinion no longer matters to your peace, when their presence doesn't disrupt your calm, when you can sit in silence and feel complete without their approval. That's the kind of peace I woke up to each morning. My garden flourished. My kitchen smelled like cinnamon and coffee. I had started painting again. Landscapes first, then portraits of people I remembered from earlier days. Matthew and Caroline sold their condo 6 months later. They moved to another city, according to Jessica, who still visited regularly. She said her mother couldn't handle living so close to me, seeing daily evidence of what they had done. "Are you happy they're gone?" Jessica asked one evening as we worked on a jigsaw puzzle. I considered the question carefully. "I'm happy I'm here," I answered. "That's what matters." That winter, I was invited to speak at the senior center about elder rights and financial protection. I stood before a group of men and women, most near my age, and told them the truth. "They will call you elderly," I said. "They will call you a burden. They will make decisions about your life while smiling to your face. But remember this: age doesn't diminish your rights. It doesn't erase your voice, and it certainly doesn't transfer your power to anyone else unless you allow it." Several people approached me afterward, sharing similar stories, asking questions about legal resources. One woman hugged me tightly and whispered, "Thank you for making me feel less alone." That's what it's really about in the end. Not revenge, but reclamation. Not just my story, but all our stories. Ensuring they don't end in sterile rooms where we're expected to fade away quietly. Making sure we aren't erased just because our hair has turned silver and our steps have slowed. I went home that evening and looked around the house I had created for myself, smaller than my old one, but filled with choices that were mine alone. As Jessica called to say she was bringing dinner, I realized I wasn't at the end of anything. At 73, I was standing at the beginning of a new chapter. They put me in a nursing home and called me a burden. But in the end, I showed them what a burden truly was: the weight of consequence that follows when you underestimate someone who refuses to be written out of their own life. If this story moved you, don't forget to like and subscribe. Remember that age is just a number, and your voice matters at every stage of life. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments below.